Not surprisingly, God is much more patient than I am. When I see a weed popping up in the garden over here, I take it out immediately. If I don't, after 1 week, you would see a big garden of weeds growing out next to our side entrance. Those weeds, I admit, drive me crazy. They are much more resilient than any flowers or bushes that I want to grow. So I'm thinking that God must be really tolerant if the parable of the wheat and weeds is to be taken seriously. Why does God allow weeds to flourish next to healthy, food-giving wheat? Why does God allow evil to exist? Why does God allow such tragedies to happen like last Thursday over Ukraine? Why does God allow weeds to grow? Perhaps the difference between me and God, well, there are many differences, but one, a very significant one, is that I am not in control, and God is. No matter how OCD you are and I am, we are not in control. We may enjoy living in the illusion that we control things, that the outcome is up to us. But if you are humble enough to acknowledge reality, you will have to say, I am not in control of my life. I am not in control of my day. Even more so, how can I be in control of this world? We make all kinds of plans, and it's good. We schedule our day, our week, our month, our year. We plan out our life. I want to be married by 25, have children by 30, be a grandmother by 50, by 60, retired, and so on. A beautiful plan, right? Does it always happen according to our plan? Most often than not, no. We make the plans, we plan all the steps from A to B to C and to Y and Z, but usually by the time we get to C, all the plan is gone down the sink. That's the difference between us planning and God's planning. What God wants, what God desires, happens. Of course, in philosophy classes, they taught us that there is a big distinction between saying that what God wants happens and what happens God wants. No. Everything that God wants to happen does happen, but not everything that happens God desires to happen. God doesn't desire weeds to grow along the wheat. But for our sake, God allows the weeds to coexist along with the wheat. Another parable for today's gospel spoke about yeast and mixing the yeast with 3 measures of wheat flour. If you bake your own bread once in a while, you know that it doesn't take lots of yeast to make bread. As a matter of fact, it's enough to take a small amount of yeast to make beautiful, delicious, several servings of bread for your family. So clearly, yeast in Jesus' mind is something positive. It's something that we as believers are called to imitate in our lives. Whereas weeds are something to be avoided. Now think about for a second about those two images. The weeds that are metaphor for everything that is evil in this world, and the yeast, which is a symbol for all that is good in this world. Weeds, even though annoying, ugly, undesirable, at the end do not take over. Weeds at the end are disposed of, whereas yeast at the end does take over everything. A small amount of yeast is enough to change the face of the world. And no matter how many weeds there will be, they will never conquer the world. Sometimes it appears to us that there is so much evil in our life. There is so much misery, not misery, misery in this world that we think, is God still in control? Yes. No matter how many weeds there are in your life, it takes a tiny, small amount of yeast to transform your life. As a matter of fact, as Christians, we don't believe that entire population of the world has to become Christian. We don't need to convert everyone to Catholicism. We don't need to make everyone believe the same things we believe. We are called, my friends, to be like this yeast, to change the world, to transform the world by our very presence. We don't need to take over the world. We don't need to make everyone look and behave and pray like us. But if we stand for justice, if we stand for equality, if we stand for love, we are that small, tiny amount of yeast that has power to transform everything and everyone around us. Some of you remember the good old 60s. Who is old enough to remember the 60s? Raise your hand. Good. I saw movies and read books. I like especially those nice German vans, the Volkswagen vans, the flowers around it. So I have this image of the 60s with hippies and flower children, all the happy people. And I think from the 60s came to us this very popular idea of so-called yin and yang in the world. You know what I'm talking about? This image of a globe, and half of it is black, half of it is white. It comes from the Far East, from Asian cultures that believe in a ever-going battle and balance between good and evil in this world. That night and day balance each other. That love and hatred complement each other constantly. That there is this never-ending of battle between goodness and evil in the world. And because there is a balance, none of them has an upper hand. I think that's basically a very short description of yin and yang idea. That light and darkness, good and evil, love and hatred are continuously fighting and balancing each other. Ever since the 60s, we have believed and taken this yin and yang concept for granted. We think that this is how the world exists. This is how the world works. Well, if you are a Christian, it isn't so. If you believe that Jesus has conquered death, there is no more struggle between life and death. The battle has been won. If you believe that small amount of yeast takes over the whole batch of flour, there is no balance between good and evil. Good has won. If you believe that God is in control of both the weeds and the wheat, there is no fight between love and hatred. Love has won. Ever since Plato, you know Plato, back before Jesus in Greece, ever since Plato, we have been plagued by this idea of dualism, two equal forces fighting each other. We have been manipulated to think that there are two gods, the good God and the bad God, fighting over the world. In Christianity, many times we think that evil or Satan or devil is someone equal to God, whom God has to fight and struggle with. It isn't so. Evil is not equal to good. Hatred is not equal to love. Night, darkness is not equal to light. If you are a Christian, if you believe that God is in control, that yeast takes over everything else, yin and yang ain't happening.